Prosperity of the 1920s. The 1920s were prosperous times for many Americans. After the initial slump in the economy in 1919 to 1920, wages and employment opportunities began to rise while business profits and production soared. Government policies favoring business were one factor behind this prosperity. There were several others that we'll talk about today. Your first essential question is what factors sparked the prosperity of the 1920s? Make sure to write that down either at the top of your page or in your notebook, but make sure you write it down. The rise of the automobile. Probably the single most important factor behind the prosperity of the 1920s was the expanded use of the automobile. The growth in automobile ownership from 8 to 24 million greatly affected all aspects of American life. Automobile production required vast amounts of steel, glass, and rubber, stimulating those industries. By 1929, 1 out of every 9 workers was employed in an auto-related industry. Cars gave people greater mobility. Families were now able to drive away on vacation. The growth of suburbs was also made possible by car. School buses allowed students in remote and rural areas to attend school regularly for the very first time. Henry Ford was an engineer and an early automobile manufacturer. His goal was to build cars that everyone could afford. His Model T, introduced in 1905, was the very first car that many middle-class Americans could buy. He introduced the assembly line in 1914, increasing production by moving cars along a conveyor belt while workers completed their assigned tasks. By 1924, Ford was producing 1.6 million cars a year at a price of less than $300 per car. By 1925, 1 car was rolling off of Ford's assembly line every 10 seconds. Ford's new assembly line production was so efficient, he was able to double wages overnight while slashing prices. Ford wanted to give workers enough buying power to purchase the cars and other goods that they were mass producing.
100 years ago, on October 1913, Henry Ford introduced one of history's great inventions, the assembly line. It transformed industry worldwide.
And the mass-produced Model T helped create the American middle class. Dean Reynolds went to Ford's original plant in Detroit to learn more.
The assembly line has always been an impressive mix of man and machine. What it looks like now is a far cry from a century ago when Henry Ford first embraced the idea, one that wound up turning America into an industrial powerhouse with a thriving middle class. Bill Ford is executive chairman of Ford Motor Company and the great-grandson of Henry.
Well, he had visited the meatpacking business in Illinois, and he saw there that the people were stationary and the product was moved to them. And he thought, well, why can't I apply that same principle to the car industry? So that's really where he got the innovation for it.
Until Ford's stroke of genius, his automobiles were basically custom-made trophies for the wealthy. That changed.
The assembly line did 2 things. One is it gave mobility to the average American, and the other is the employment in the plants helped create the middle class.
The process itself has aged well and continues to improve.
To build a quality car, you have to be able to have your operator be able to do it efficiently and to do it injury-free.
Allison Stevens is a technical specialist at Ford's ergonomic lab.
And you now are seeing 3D, and you are inside the computer looking at the design of one of our vehicles.
She showed us how, with 3D animation, she and her team can approximate an assembly line in the quiet of their office, testing parts and designs without the need to build an actual model.
You're seeing every fastener, every hole, every bend in the metal.
This virtual trial and error can tell Ford whether bolts turn, tires fit, or antennas are within reach to maximize efficiency up and down the actual line. Bill Ford likes that kind of thinking.
The assembly line's changed a lot in 100 years. It's still an assembly line, and that to me is really remarkable.
The proof of that can be seen in car after car after car. For CBS This Morning Saturday, Dean Reynolds, Detroit.
It's remarkable.
Automobile industry wasn't the only industry that rose during the 1920s. We also had new discoveries and inventions in almost every field, laying the framework for many new businesses. These inventions included improvements in transmitting electrical power, improved motors, and a new transatlantic telephone service. New household appliances like the vacuum cleaner, refrigerator, and toaster were also introduced. Radio and motion pictures became widespread. The American chemical industry expanded, and the use of oil and natural gas increased. These new industries created new jobs and changed the way that Americans lived. Glenn Curtiss, the first airplane using an engine similar to that in a car, was flown by the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903. But Glenn Curtiss was also an early aviation pioneer. In 1908, he turned his attention to designing a seaplane that could take off and land on water. 3 years later, he successfully flew his hydro aeroplane in San Diego Bay, landing on a naval ship. His landing marked the birth of U.S. naval aviation and convinced the Secretary of the Navy to buy the Navy's very first aircraft. In 1912, Curtiss developed a larger flying boat, and in 1919, he constructed the first airplane to cross the Atlantic Ocean for the U.S. Navy. More efficient production techniques. The 1920s saw remarkable improvements in manufacturing efficiency. As you know, Ford introduced electronic conveyor belts to his assembly lines. Each car moved along the belt to different groups of workers who completed one small part of the assembly. With this method, production was suddenly 6 times faster. Use of the conveyor belt and other new techniques spread, making industry generally more productive. When manufacturers first adopted the assembly line to their production process, they often achieved dramatic gains in productivity, and consumers benefited from lower prices. However, one unforeseen consequence was a radical change in the nature of factory work. Skilled workers were no longer needed, even in complex manufacturing operations like car assembly. Mass consumption. Along with changes in production, the 1920s witnessed new patterns of consumption, creating mass markets for goods. Advertising stimulated demand, while workers with higher wages and more leisure time had greater purchasing power. Retailers developed new programs for installment purchases and buying on credit. The buyer had to pay a small down payment to take home an item. Then the buyer would pay the rest in small monthly payments, which included interest. Through installment plans, consumers were able to buy more expensive goods, such as cars, refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, furniture, radios, which they could not otherwise afford. Once one seller offered an installment plan, competitors were usually forced to do the same. The table on the next slide, you'll see that the majority of costly items were bought using installment plans. So you guys can see from 1921 to 1929, 75% of Americans bought automobiles on an installment plan. 89% phonographs, 65% vacuum cleaner, 85% furniture, pardon me, 75% washing machine, and then even 25% buying jewelry on credit. The speculation boom. Speculation is the purchase of any item, not for personal use, but in the hope of selling it later at a higher price. The 1920s saw the spread of speculation in stocks and real estate. The development of new industries, improved production techniques, and the expansion of mass markets led the shares of corporations listed on the stock market to climb to dizzying heights. Gains in stock fueled speculation. As people read about these successes, it enticed them to buy more stocks for easy profit. As more people bought stocks, stock prices went up even higher. And you can see how that cycle continued to grow, that people saw prices go up, they bought stocks, prices went up, people bought stocks, prices went up. And you guys can kind of see how that stock market ball is going to get rolling. Uneven prosperity. Not all groups participated equally in the prosperity of the 1920s. Wealth was highly concentrated. According to one study in 1929, the top 1,000th of Americans had a combined income equal to that of the bottom 42%. The same top group controlled about 1/3 of all savings, while more than 3/4 of Americans had no savings at all. Many Americans still faced poverty. With the introduction of tractors and spread of electricity, farmers faced lower incomes due to overproduction. Railroads suffered from new competition with cars, and textile workers faced lower wages because of foreign competition. Minority groups also faced discrimination in employment.